License and registration. Boy. The words cut through the quiet moment as Officer Travis Lawson stepped toward the driver's side door with a hand already resting on his holster, the insult landing with a weight that carried 30 years of buried hate in the next breath. The violence came fast. The first shot tore into Cameron Jackson's shoulder as he bent to retrieve the military phone Lawson had tossed to the pavement. The second shot drove through his thigh as the cuffs clicked shut, dropping him to one knee in sharp, humiliating pain that stole the air from his lungs and blurred his vision. In that instant, even Lawson did not understand that these two reckless bullets would end his career, stain his family name, and open the darkest wound Oakwood had spent decades hiding. His life, his future, and his freedom collapsed the moment he pulled the trigger, though he had no sense of it yet. Standing above a wounded man he believed had no power to fight back. Before we continue this story, let me know where you are watching from, subscribe to the channel, and give me a like so more people can follow this journey. At 7:47 p.m., Major Cameron Jackson pulled into the Walgreens parking lot to pick up the medication his grandmother needed for the night. The kind she could not sleep without. The kind he always brought the moment she asked. His return to Oakwood still felt unreal, as though he had stepped back into a house filled with memories he had tried so hard to outrun. He carried the weight of long deployments, the medals no one could see, and the post-traumatic stress disorder he tried to hide from his daughter. All he wanted tonight was to finish the errand, drive back to his grandmother's house, and sit with her until she fell asleep. But Lawson had followed him for 3 blocks, watching the broken headlight, imagining a threat where there was none, convincing himself that the man behind the wheel could not possibly belong in his town. Cameron kept his hands visible the moment the patrol lights flashed. His voice stayed calm. "I am Major Cameron Jackson, United States Army." Lawson ignored the words. The badge on his chest did not mean order to him. It meant power. He reached through the open window, grabbed Cameron's military phone, and tossed it onto the pavement with a mocking smirk. Cameron leaned forward, careful and slow, every movement measured. His ribs tightened as the shots exploded, the sound echoing through the quiet lot with a force that stunned even him. He felt the heat of the bullet in his shoulder first, then the crushing burn in his thigh, the cold metal cuffs already locked around his wrists. Blood spread across his old Prairie View agricultural and mechanical shirt, the shirt his father had worn before him, the shirt he kept for days like this, days when he needed to feel anchored to something stronger than pain. On the ground beside him, the military phone vibrated once, silent, hidden, activating a classified protocol no civilian in Oakwood had ever heard of, Protocol Phoenix. A chain of alerts spread across encrypted networks, lighting up servers and sensors across 3 states. Within seconds, a red indicator flashed inside the Pentagon Watch Center. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Ramirez leaned forward, eyes narrowing as Cameron's vitals, location, and the first seconds of grainy body footage streamed across her screen. She shouted into the intercom with a steady voice sharpened by urgency. "Officer down, domestic, Major Cameron Jackson." Her words moved with precision through the room. Generals stood, analysts pushed away their chairs. A map of East Texas expanded across the wall with Cameron's fading heartbeat pulsing in the corner. Within minutes, someone placed a secure call to the one person who had the authority to launch the response Oakwood had never imagined. General Michelle Grant listened without speaking. She had seen war, loss, and every shade of injustice. She had lost soldiers under her command, buried their names, and carried their stories with a weight she never allowed anyone to see. But the moment she heard Cameron's name, she knew this would be different. The voice on the line described 2 shots, one man bleeding, a local officer holding the weapon, a system that had failed before anyone could intervene. Michelle Grant ended the call with 5 words that moved like a hammer through the operations floor. Wheels up. We leave now. She knew what Oakwood had done. She knew what it had hidden. And she knew that tonight, the truth would not stay buried. On Main Street. Lawson stood over Cameron with a face full of contempt, unaware that the world was already turning against him. He muttered under his breath, pacing, shaking, half proud and half frightened by what he had done. He believed the town would protect him. He believed the badge would shield him. He believed no one important would ever care. But there are moments in life when arrogance blinds a man so completely that he steps willingly into the destruction he has created for himself. This was that moment for Lawson. Every decision he had made in the past 10 minutes would follow him for the rest of his life. 9 minutes after the shots. The first military alert reached Regional Command. 4 minutes later. The flight deck at Fort Cavazos cleared for departure. Pilots sprinted to their helicopters as crew chiefs locked down gear, sealed doors, and ran final checks. Soldiers fastened harnesses and spoke in quick, clipped sentences. Every second mattered because Cameron's heart rate was slipping. The flight manifest loaded. The rotors began to spin. Dust rose from the tarmac. At 19 minutes, 2 Black Hawk helicopters lifted into the night sky, their engines thundering through the darkness with a force that shook windows across the base. Oakwood still did not know what was coming. Cameron lay bleeding against the curb, his breaths uneven, his vision dimming. Yet even as pain pressed through him, he felt the faint vibration of the phone again, a pulse he recognized, a signal he had trained to understand. Help was coming. Real help. Help that did not depend on local politics or whispered promises. Help that answered to a higher oath. By the time the Blackhawks reached the tree line outside town, Cameron was drifting in and out of consciousness. But he would remember the sound. The deep, rising thunder of rotor blades cutting through the Texas night. A sound Lawson would never forget. A sound that marked the beginning of the end for every corrupt man who had controlled Oakwood for 3 decades. Ronnie Brooks had always believed the past could be buried. He believed that memory faded, that truth lost its voice, that a frightened 14-year-old boy would grow into a man who no longer remembered the way his father's body fell to the pavement in 1994. But memory lives in the places where pain was born. And on this night, as 2 Black Hawk helicopters screamed toward Oakwood, the ghosts of that year rose with a force he could no longer control. Cameron Jackson had been only a child then, standing beside Marcus Jackson during a stop that never should have happened, listening to Ronnie bark orders designed to provoke fear, watching his father keep his hands raised, steady and calm. Marcus had spoken a simple sentence. "My son is here. Please be careful." Ronnie answered with a bullet. The county ruled it justified in 48 hours. Cameron carried that image into adulthood like a wound that never healed, shaping the man he became, the soldier he trained to be, and the nightmares that followed him into every deployment. He learned to track insurgents through mountains, to interrogate men who lied for a living, to read silence as clearly as sound. Yet he could not escape the memory of his father's hand slipping from his own as the life drained out of him on a Texas road. That single moment carved a hollow in him that no medal, promotion, or battlefield victory could ever fill. In the present, as the Black Hawks descended through the night, the sound vibrated through the bones of everyone on Main Street. Dust lifted from the pavement. People stepped back, shielding their eyes as the rotor wash spread across the storefronts. Cameron lay strapped to a stretcher beside the ambulance, drifting between consciousness and darkness. His mind caught somewhere between the memory of 1994 and the pain of this new wound. His breathing was shallow, his hands were cold, yet he forced his eyes open when he heard the engines roar overhead. He knew that sound. He had trained inside aircraft like these. He had seen them carry wounded soldiers out of danger. Tonight, He was the one being carried, and he felt a quiet shame rise in him, an old instinct whispering that he should be the protector, not the one protected. But shame gave way to something steadier as the helicopter's shadow passed over him. Someone powerful had answered the call, someone who would not let Oakwood bury another Jackson. General Michelle Grant stepped out of the helicopter with a precision that told everyone she had led men and women through places far more hostile than this small Texas street. She wore no expression of shock, only the cold, controlled anger of a commander who had seen one of her own shot and left to bleed on a sidewalk. Her boots touched the ground with purpose, her eyes cut toward Lawson, who stood near the patrol car with his hands half raised, half defiant, half confused. She walked straight toward him, her voice calm and final. "You just shot one of mine. Hands up." Lawson hesitated. He did not fully understand who she was. He understood only that someone he had never seen before, a black woman in full general uniform, was speaking to him as though his badge meant nothing. Panic flickered behind his eyes. His feet shifted. Then he made the mistake that sealed his fate. He ran. The operators moved before anyone else could react. A military working dog sprinted past them, closing the distance with ruthless speed. Lawson made it only 20 yards before the dog took him down in the dirt, locking onto his arm with a force that ripped the last illusion of power from him. He screamed. The sound rose and then broke into short. Ragged breaths as the operators secured him, rolled him onto his stomach, and placed him in restraints far stronger than any he had placed on Cameron. Michelle Grant watched without blinking. She saw the man who had believed himself untouchable. She saw the stain of arrogance on him, and she saw the truth she had known the moment she received the call. Oakwood had become a place where the uniform she served meant less than a simple lie told by a corrupt officer. Nearby, Cameron struggled to remain awake long enough to understand what was happening. His consciousness blurred between memory and reality. He saw the helicopter lights, bright and sharp. He heard footsteps approaching. He felt the sting of antiseptic on his skin as medics checked his wounds. He tried to lift his hand. It felt heavy. He tried to speak. The words broke into a whisper. "Is my grandmother safe?" A medic leaned close, steadying the oxygen mask against his face. "We will take care of her. You hold tight." Cameron closed his eyes again, letting the voice wrap around him like a promise. In the crowd, people recorded everything with shaking hands. Some whispered in disbelief. Others hid tears. Margaret Thompson stood on her porch across the street, her phone still raised, her voice trembling as she narrated for the millions who would soon watch. "They shot that man for nothing, and now the army is here. I never thought I would see something like this." She did not flinch as the wind from the helicopter pushed against her clothes. She kept filming because she knew, deep in her bones, that truth was fragile unless captured. She had lived through years when justice belonged only to those who could afford it. She would not let this moment vanish. Meanwhile, miles away, Ronnie Brooks received the first frantic call that something had gone wrong. Lawson had fired. Cameron was down. Helicopters were landing on Main Street. Ronnie froze in his office, the memories of 1994 pushing against him with brutal clarity. He had silenced Marcus Jackson. He had silenced 2 other men who threatened his operation. He had silenced evidence, complaints, and whispered questions for 30 years. But he could not silence a military response. He could not silence a protocol he had never heard of. And he could not silence a general who stood on his street with a face carved from iron. For the first time in decades, fear took root in him. He understood that the past he thought he had buried was coming back with force. As Cameron was lifted into the helicopter, medics worked quickly, pressing gauze against the wounds, securing the IV, keeping his heartbeat steady. The rotor wash rumbled through him. His vision dimmed again, but before he slipped fully into unconsciousness, he heard one last thing, the general's voice, calm, strong, uncompromising. Get him home. He has carried enough. Her words settled over him like a hand resting gently on his shoulder. And then the world faded as the helicopter rose, carrying him away from the place that had broken him once as a boy and nearly again as a man. Behind them, Oakwood trembled in the dark, knowing something irreversible had begun. The truth had returned. The ghosts had awakened. And the fight that started in 1994 was no longer just Cameron's. It belonged to the nation now. Margaret Thompson had lived on East Maple Street for 40 years, long enough to know the difference between noise worth ignoring and noise that meant something terrible had happened. And when she heard the gunshots that night, she did not hesitate. She walked out onto her porch with the steadiness of a woman who had survived 2 eras of Jim Crow, 3 decades of quiet intimidation, and a lifetime of broken promises about justice. Her late husband had always told her she carried more courage in her small frame than most men carried in their whole lives, and as she lifted her iPhone to record the chaos unfolding across the street, she felt that same courage settle over her once more. The camera captured everything. Lawson standing over a wounded Cameron, the blood spreading across the pavement, the moment the Black Hawks descended, the arrival of General Michelle Grant and the military team, and the sound of Margaret's own voice trembling, not with fear, but with truth. They shot that man for nothing, she said. Filming without pause, they think nobody is watching, but we are watching tonight. She uploaded the video at 8:15 p.m., intending only to preserve the truth, not expecting what would follow. Within an hour, it swept across Texas. By midnight, it had reached 22 million views. People shared it with the same urgency that Margaret had felt on her porch. They watched Lawson shove Cameron. They watched the shots. They watched the military arrive. And they understood that Oakwood, Texas, had become the center of a storm no one could stop. As the video spread, Oakwood police officers began to panic. They drove past Margaret's house with their lights off, hoping she would step outside so they could intimidate her, as they had done to others over the years. When 2 officers finally approached her porch and told her to hand over the phone before you ruin the whole town, she held it tighter and looked them straight in the eye. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and final. I stayed quiet through Jim Crow. Not anymore. They stepped back, uncertain, shaken by the strength in her tone. They could not threaten a woman who had lived long enough to stop fearing men like them. She turned away, closed her door, and locked it with the quiet finality of someone who had chosen her side. Meanwhile, Cameron was being airlifted toward Fort Cavazos, strapped to a stretcher inside the Black Hawk as medics worked to keep him awake. His eyes drifted open in small, painful intervals. His pulse weakened with each mile. Blood continued to seep through the bandages wrapped around his shoulder and thigh. He heard faint voices calling out numbers. He felt the pressure of a medic's hand pressing against his wound. He smelled antiseptic. But through the noise and the blur, one instinct rose above all others. He needed to know if his grandmother was safe. His voice cracked as he whispered through the oxygen mask. "Is my grandmother safe?" A medic leaned close, adjusted the mask, and spoke with soft certainty. "We will protect her. Focus on staying with us." Cameron nodded, barely, and slipped back into the gray haze between consciousness and memory, chasing fragments of his father's face, his daughter's laughter, and the long shadow of 1994 that refused to let him rest. Back in Oakwood, Connor Reed sat alone inside a small office at the station, the blue glow of the computer screen reflecting the fear he had tried to suppress for years. He had joined the department at 24, hoping he could do some good, hoping he could help people, hoping he could live differently from the men who trained him. But he began to see the truth early on. Evidence disappearing, Money exchanged under tables, patrol logs altered, complaints shredded before sunrise. Ronnie Brooks at the center of all of it, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed no one would ever question him. Connor had said nothing at first. Then little things began to bother him more deeply. A teenager beaten for no reason. A woman arrested for asking questions. A man who vanished after being taken into custody. Connor told himself he would look away only once. But once turned into twice. Twice turned into silence. Silence grew into guilt. And guilt became unbearable the night Cameron was shot. He knew, as he stared at the glowing folders on the department server, that this was his last chance to do what was right. He inserted a flash drive, clicked through encrypted files that Brooks believed only he could access, and copied everything without hesitation. Audio logs, body camera archives, drug ledger spreadsheets, transfer orders that made no sense, internal memos signed with initials instead of names. He found one document that chilled him to the bone. 800 kilograms of cocaine reported lost from evidence lockers every year for 17 years. All accounted for in a private ledger kept in a folder labeled with a harmless title, Christmas Donations. He leaned back in the chair, the breath leaving his chest in a slow, heavy exhale. He had known there was corruption. He had never imagined this scale. He removed the flash drive, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and understood that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. As the night deepened, Margaret's video continued to spread. National outlets replayed the footage, analyzing each frame. Religious leaders spoke about it in emergency live streams. Soldiers posted messages of support for Cameron. Parents told their children they were watching history happen, for the first time in Oakwood's long, troubled past. Truth traveled faster than intimidation. Lies crumbled in the face of 22 million witnesses who saw the moment a Black Army major, home to care for his grandmother, was shot despite raising his hands, despite identifying himself, despite doing everything the officer demanded. Cameron regained consciousness for a moment as the helicopter approached Fort Cavazos. He felt the weight of the neck brace. He saw bright lights above him. His fingers twitched. He heard someone say, "We are landing!" He wanted to speak. He wanted to ask again about his grandmother. But the words did not come. Instead, an overwhelming exhaustion settled through him. An exhaustion built from years of serving a country that had always asked more of him than it ever returned. He let his eyes close, trusting that the people in this aircraft would carry him the rest of the way. In Oakwood. Connor stepped out of the station with the flash drive in his pocket, knowing the moment he crossed the parking lot. He was no longer an officer of the department he had joined. He was a witness, a whistleblower, a man who had chosen truth over survival. Margaret stood inside her house, watching her video rise across the world. Lawson sat in restraints, bleeding from the dog bite on his arm, shaking with the first waves of fear he had ever felt in his professional life. And Ronnie Brooks stood alone in his office, staring at the phone on his desk, listening to the quiet, waiting for news he already knew would destroy him. Cameron Jackson should not have been on his feet, yet at 3 a.m, wrapped in gauze, stitched at the shoulder, and limping from the wound in his thigh. He moved through the shadows beside Officer Connor Reed with the silent determination of a man who refused to let the past remain buried any longer. He had been released under military supervision for only a few hours, his body still aching from the helicopter flight and emergency treatment. But his mind burned with one goal: to find the truth about his father. Connor led him toward the old evidence warehouse at the edge of Oakwood, a place that had been locked for decades, a place everyone avoided, a place where the town claimed nothing important remained. Connor carried a crowbar in his hands, his voice low and tense as he whispered, "If Brooks kept anything, he kept it here." Cameron nodded with slow, steady resolve. He had lived his entire adult life with an unspoken question pressed against his ribs. Tonight, he would learn the answer. The door opened with a groan that sounded like a cry from the past. The air inside was cold, stale, thick with dust and the weight of forgotten crimes. Shelves lined the walls, covered in boxes labeled with numbers no longer used by any active system. Evidence tags hung loose. Bags had yellowed. Files had curled. Cameron moved through the rows with careful steps, his breath controlled, his eyes sharp despite the pain that pressed against him. A faint memory tugged at him. The smell of this place, the silence, the echo of boots. He had been here once as a boy, dragged by his mother to demand answers about the night his father died. They told her the case file had been misplaced. They told her there was nothing to see. They told her to leave and not return. He remembered her tears when she returned to the car, her face in her hands, the tremor in her voice as she said she was sorry. He had carried that memory like a scar. Connor stopped near a concrete slab at the back of the warehouse. It was out of place, too clean, too smooth, poured recently compared to the rest of the building. He crouched beside it and whispered. This was poured in '94. No construction orders, no documentation, just this slab. Cameron felt the air thicken. His heartbeat slowed. He knelt beside the slab, touching the cold surface with trembling fingers. He did not need a name. He did not need a clue. He felt it in his bones. His father was here. Connor lifted the crowbar and wedged it beneath the edge. The concrete cracked, groaned, and began to crumble in jagged pieces. Cameron braced himself as the first opening revealed a dark, shallow pit beneath the floor. Connor shined the flashlight into the space. Bones. Fabric remnants. A rusted belt buckle Cameron recognized from an old photograph. For a long moment, neither man breathed. The truth had been buried under concrete for 30 years. Cameron reached into the pit with shaking hands, lifting a small metal tag still attached to the belt. His father's initials were engraved on the back. His eyes closed slowly, as though his body had finally recognized the moment it had been moving toward for decades. He whispered with a voice stripped of strength. I knew he didn't run. I knew he didn't fight. He never would have left me. The silence was heavy and sacred. Connor's throat tightened. He had feared the truth, but not like this. Not with a man kneeling beside the bones of his father, still wearing hospital bandages, still bleeding through his shirt. Outside, headlights swept across the warehouse wall. Connor stiffened. Cameron looked up sharply. The engine revved. A door slammed. Heavy footsteps pounded toward the entrance. Connor whispered, "It's Brooks." The name struck like a warning shot. Cameron rose slowly, his hand gripping the edge of a shelf for balance. He was still half-healed, half-dizzy, half-broken. But he was ready. Ronnie Brooks stepped inside with a pistol raised, his face twisted with rage and fear. "You should have stayed out of this," he growled, pointing the gun at the man he had tried to break as a child. Cameron stood tall despite the pain, his voice steady. "You murdered my father." Brooks did not deny it. He only lifted the gun higher. The first shot came fast. Cameron felt the impact slam into his side, sending him back against the shelves. Connor fired in return, his bullet striking Brooks in the leg. Brooks collapsed to the floor with a scream that echoed through the concrete. Papers flew. Blood streaked the dust. Cameron pulled himself upright, gripping his abdomen, refusing to fall. Brooks cursed through clenched teeth, shouting accusations, threats, lies. But his voice no longer mattered. The truth lay exposed at their feet. The silence after the struggle felt deeper than any shout. Connor moved to restrain Brooks while Cameron pressed his hand against his bleeding side, breathing slowly through the pain. Outside. The world of Oakwood was erupting, News of Margaret Thompson's video had reached every home. Protesters formed around the police department. Families stood shoulder to shoulder, carrying signs with Cameron's name. Anger swelled into confrontation. Officers in riot gear pushed forward. The crowd pushed back. Something broke. A bottle shattered. A baton swung. Someone screamed. Then, the sound no town expects to hear from its own police. Live rounds fired into a crowd. Panic tore through the streets. 4 people fell. Their bodies hit the pavement in a moment that marked the darkest hour in Oakwood's history. Word spread instantly. Images flooded social media. People watched in disbelief as a small Texas town descended into violence. The mayor issued a rushed statement claiming control. The district attorney insisted the force was justified. But none of it mattered. The world had seen what Oakwood had become. A place where truth was buried under concrete. A place where a police chief murdered to protect a racket. A place where a man was shot while handcuffed. A place where a peaceful crowd had been met with bullets. Inside the warehouse. Cameron forced himself to stand. His vision blurred, but his resolve sharpened. The truth had been found. His father had been found. His wounds throbbed with fire. Yet he felt something stronger than pain. Purpose. Connor secured Brooks's gun and radioed for a federal team. Cameron leaned against the wall, his breathing unsteady. "It's over," Connor whispered. Cameron shook his head. "No, it's beginning." Across the nation, Margaret's video continued to spread, now joined by footage of the riots, the gunfire, the chaos. Reporters called it the largest civil rights crisis in modern Texas history. The president announced he would address the nation by morning. Oakwood stood on the edge of a reckoning 30 years in the making. The federal courthouse in Houston carried a tension that felt older than the building itself. A tension shaped by 30 years of silence and one night of violence that brought the entire state to its knees. And as Cameron Jackson entered the courtroom in a wheelchair, his uniform pressed, his bandages concealed beneath the fabric, the air shifted with the weight of a truth that could no longer be ignored. He had been healing for weeks. Yet every movement reminded him of the bullets that tore through him on Main Street and the deeper wound carved long ago by the loss of his father across the aisle. Ronnie Brooks sat shackled, his leg still stiff from the gunshot wound he received in the warehouse, his face pale with the fear of a man who understood that decades of power could not protect him now. Travis Lawson sat further down the row, hands trembling as he waited for the moment he would try to trade his loyalty for mercy. When the bailiff called the court to order, the silence tightened until it felt like a held breath. Judge Elena Vargas presided, her expression firm, her voice controlled, her eyes trained on the defendants with the clarity of someone who had read every file, every witness statement, every ledger Connor Reed had delivered under federal protection. The trial began with direct questions and direct answers. No theatrics, no distractions. Only the raw truth presented piece by piece until the walls of denial began to crumble. Cameron testified first, his voice steady yet heavy with emotion. He recounted the stop, the shots, the way Lawson spoke, the sound of metal cuffs tightening around his wrists as blood soaked his shirt. Then, with a controlled breath, he told the court about the night in 1994 when he watched his father raise his hands and still fall to the pavement. He described the fear in his mother's eyes, the rushed investigation, the way Oakwood silenced its own truth, and how that silence had ruled his life ever since. The courtroom listened without moving, each word sinking deeper into a space that demanded accountability. When Cameron finished, Lawson lowered his eyes and rubbed his hands together, restless, uncertain, preparing for the moment he had been coached to face. His attorney leaned in and whispered, and Lawson nodded with a defeated heaviness. He rose to testify, not out of remorse, but out of desperation for leniency. His voice cracked as he spoke. He admitted that he fired without cause, that Cameron was already handcuffed, that Brooks had told him for years to control the ones who looked like trouble, and that controlling them often meant force, intimidation, and falsified reports. Then the courtroom froze when he spoke the words everyone dreaded. Chief Brooks killed Marcus Jackson, shot him, buried him, told us it was self-defense, told us to keep quiet. Brooks slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "You lying coward!" But the marshals restrained him before he could rise. The outburst only confirmed what Lawson had begun to unravel, with each passing sentence. Lawson revealed more of Brooks's operation. The protection deals on Interstate 45, the bribed deputies, the coded ledgers, the missing cocaine rerouted to cartel partners, the silence enforced through threats, blackmail, and at times, force. Lawson's voice trembled when he described how Brooks ordered him to stop Cameron on Main Street the moment he saw the name on the license. He said, "Make it rough." He said the son was just like the father. The courtroom absorbed every word with a mixture of grief and rage. But nothing pierced the room more deeply than Cameron's reaction. He sat motionless, his hands gripping the rails of his wheelchair, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the man who had murdered the father he adored. When Lawson finished, Judge Vargas called for order, her voice sharp, but the emotion in the room could not be contained. Then came the moment destined to change the course of the trial, as the proceedings continued. And evidence was displayed across the courtroom screens. Pictures of the warehouse, the slab, the ledgers. Ronnie Brooks leaned forward toward Cameron, as though he wanted the final word before the world stripped him of every ounce of power he had ever held. His whisper cut through the air even from several feet away. Cruel and deliberate. Your daddy died because he stuck his nose where it didn't belong. For 30 years, Cameron had carried the image of his dying father with a silent dignity that often broke him in the quiet of night. But this taunt sliced through him with the violence of the past he never left behind. He lunged forward before he realized he was moving. Instinct overtaking restraint, grief erupting into a force that startled the entire courtroom. Federal marshals caught him just before he reached Brooks. His body trembled with emotion. But Judge Vargas intervened with a calm, resolute voice. "Major Jackson, return to your seat. Justice will answer him. You do not need to." Cameron froze, breathed deeply, and allowed himself to be guided back, his eyes never leaving the man who destroyed his childhood. The court then turned to Connor Reed. His testimony carried a different kind of weight, the weight of a conscience awakened after years of silent complicity. He explained how he discovered the ledgers, how he copied the hard drive, how he had watched men like Lawson and Brooks exert control through fear. He admitted his failures, his silence, his shame, and then said, with quiet conviction, "I will not be silent again." He handed over the complete drug ledger that tied Judge Billy Ray Cunningham to years of bribe payments. Within hours, federal agents entered Cunningham's chambers and arrested him before his afternoon docket, the gavel still warm in his hand. Oakwood's corruption had reached the highest levels, and the courtroom understood the sweep of the operation only now being revealed. By the end of the day, the evidence stood tall and irrefutable. Photographs of the remains of Marcus Jackson, audio files of Brooks's threats, financial trails leading into private accounts, testimony from victims who had remained silent for decades. Every secret Oakwood had held was now laid bare before the court. Brooks glared at the witnesses with a hatred that could no longer control anything around him. His kingdom had collapsed. His lies had dissolved. His voice, once loud enough to silence an entire town, carried no authority in this room. The jury returned to the courtroom with a silence so complete it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. And in those still moments, every person present understood that 30 years of violence, fear, silence, and buried truth would now be measured in minutes. Judge Elena Vargas looked over her glasses, her expression composed, her voice steady. Yet even she sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. Cameron Jackson sat in his wheelchair beside the federal prosecutors. The pain in his body held firmly behind a quiet strength. He had waited a lifetime for this moment, not for vengeance, but for truth that no one could bury again. Ronnie Brooks stared forward with hollow eyes, understanding that his empire had collapsed. Travis Lawson shifted in his seat with the trembling anxiety of a man who knew his plea deal had bought him nothing more than the faintest hope of survival. When Judge Vargas asked if the jury had reached a verdict, the foreperson rose and spoke 4 words that carried the weight of an entire state. "We have." Your Honor. What followed unfolded with a swift clarity that cut through 3 decades of corruption. The foreperson read the first verdict. On the charge of attempted murder in the 1st degree, we find the defendant, Travis Lawson, guilty. Lawson closed his eyes as the courtroom murmured, the word guilty echoing through him like a sentence he had known deep down from the moment he fired his weapon. Then the second charge, civil rights violations under color of law, guilty. Excessive force resulting in great bodily harm, guilty. The list continued, each count marking a life forever changed, each word stripping away the uniform Lawson once believed protected him. When the final charge was read, Lawson sagged back in his chair, his career, his freedom, and his identity erased in less time than it took him to pull the trigger. Then came the verdict everyone awaited with a tension that nearly shook the room. On the charge of 1st-degree murder of Marcus Jackson, we find the defendant, Ronnie Brooks, guilty. The words struck like a bell. Cameron inhaled sharply. A breath held for 30 years finally released. The foreperson continued, racketeering, guilty. Conspiracy, guilty. Tampering with evidence, guilty. Drug distribution, guilty. Abuse of authority, guilty. The counts went on, each one painting a portrait of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Ronnie Brooks did not blink. His face remained cold, stripped of its bravado, stripped of its power. He looked not at Cameron, but at the wall, as though he could not bear to face the man whose life he tried to destroy. Judge Vargas closed the folder before her and spoke her ruling with a clear, unwavering tone. Lawson, 35 years without parole. Brooks, life without parole, to be served in federal prison, without privilege or protective custody. The room remained silent, absorbing the truth that justice had finally spoken. Yet the consequences of that verdict extended far beyond the courthouse. When Lawson entered Huntsville prison, he carried with him a reputation that no man inside could overlook. A former Marine, a former officer who shot a Black Army major while handcuffed. Within days, tension brewed around him. Within weeks, it erupted. 19 stab wounds, a fight in the shower block, a permanent paralysis that left him confined to a bed for the rest of his life. He survived. But the man who once strutted through Oakwood as if he owned its streets now lay helpless, unable to move without assistance, unable to speak without fear, living with the consequences of his own cruelty. Ronnie Brooks fared no better. 9 days after his sentencing, guards found him in his solitary cell, the thin bedsheet twisted into a rope, the final act of a man who chose escape over accountability. His note, angered, bitter, delusional, contained only one line. I protected this town. Now the town killed me. The nation read it with disbelief. Oakwood read it with a mixture of relief and sorrow, knowing that justice for Marcus Jackson had come, but the pain he caused would not vanish overnight. Within weeks, the Department of Justice took direct control of the Oakwood Police Department. Audits revealed missing evidence dating back 25 years. falsified arrest records, bribes disguised as donations, and a network of officers who enforced a hierarchy built on fear and silence. One by one, those involved were suspended, investigated, charged, or dismissed. Some cooperated with federal authorities, some fled, others resigned quietly, hoping to avoid the spotlight. But no one escaped the reality that the department they once believed unbreakable had dissolved in the wake of one man's survival and one town's long-buried truth. The state of Texas, under national pressure, ordered a full disbandment of the Oakwood Police Department. Every badge surrendered, every vehicle impounded, every office cleared, every complaint reopened. Federal oversight replaced local control, with new officers recruited from across the state, each vetted through a rigorous process designed to prevent corruption from taking root again. For the first time in the town's history, Oakwood would rebuild its law enforcement foundation from the ground up, without the weight of men like Brooks or the shadows of their crimes. Meanwhile, Cameron continued his recovery in a military medical center, surrounded by surgeons, therapists, and commanders who understood not only the wounds on his body, but the wounds carried in his mind. His nights were marked by memories of gunfire, of dust rising in Iraq, of the concrete slab where his father lay, of the sound of the cuffs clicking around his wrists while he bled on the ground. But as the weeks passed, he also found something he had not felt in years, a lightness in his chest, a sense that the truth had finally risen, that the man who stole his father's life could no longer haunt him. He watched the trial recordings. He read the verdict. He listened to the letters of support sent by soldiers, veterans, families, and strangers across the country who saw in him a symbol of resilience and justice. Connor Reed, under federal protection, testified before a statewide commission. His words changed the course of Texas policing policy, prompting new laws regarding evidence handling, officer oversight, and whistleblower protections. He lived with the knowledge that he had waited too long to act, but he also carried the certainty that he finally stood on the right side of truth. 1 year later, the morning sun rose over Oakwood with a gentleness the town had not felt in decades. And as Cameron Jackson stepped out of the black SUV at Eastview Cemetery, now walking without assistance though still carrying the faint stiffness of old wounds, he felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into a quiet place within him. The wind moved softly across the grass as he approached his father's headstone, a simple marker that had waited 30 years for the truth to be spoken aloud. He carried his bronze star in his hand, the medal he had earned in a distant war, the medal he had once believed he did not deserve because he could not save the one man whose life mattered most. Yet today he understood that honoring his father meant carrying forward the strength the man had given him, not the guilt that had haunted him. He knelt, placed the medal on the cool stone, and whispered, "I came home. Dad." The words came from a place deep within him, a place shaped by trauma, sacrifice, survival, and the long road toward justice. His voice trembled, but only with gratitude. In the year since the verdicts, Oakwood had transformed in ways no one had imagined possible. A federal transition team had overseen the complete reconstruction of the police department, replacing every officer who had served under Ronnie Brooks. For the first time in the town's 148-year history, Oakwood elected a black police chief, a woman named Clarissa Hodge, whose leadership brought calm and transparency to a community once fractured by fear. Public meetings were open and crowded. Citizens asked questions without being silenced. Children walked to school without avoiding certain streets. Stores that once closed early stayed open late, no longer worried about the intimidation that hovered over them for generations. The sound of sirens no longer meant danger. It meant service. People spoke of change not as a distant dream, but as a reality they lived each day. Cameron returned to active duty as a lieutenant colonel after months of rehabilitation. And with that return came a new sense of purpose. He worked with military and civilian leaders to build a national initiative aimed at protecting vulnerable communities from the kind of unchecked power that had ruled Oakwood for decades. The Jackson Sentinel Foundation, named not only for his father, but for every victim of silent corruption, distributed 75,000 recording devices across the country in its first year, ensuring that every person, regardless of race, status, or income, could document their encounters with law enforcement. Schools integrated Sentinel training into their safety programs. Churches hosted community workshops. Veterans groups volunteered to teach the elderly how to use the devices. The initiative grew beyond anything Cameron had imagined, transforming him from a victim of violence into a champion for accountability. At home, life changed in quieter, more intimate ways. Aaliyah moved in with her father full-time, her small suitcase parked neatly beside her bedroom wall at his grandmother's house, now hers as well. She decorated her room with drawings of helicopters, stars, and the word hope written in careful block letters. She held his hand when nightmares rose, whispering, "You're safe, Daddy," with the same tenderness he once wished he could give his own father. Cameron and his ex-wife, Danielle, found a peaceful rhythm of co-parenting built on respect and shared commitments. On weekends, the three of them attended community forums together, showing a united front before audiences eager to understand how healing could begin after trauma. Loretta Jackson, proud but gently tired from the weight of the year, became the voice of wisdom at every town hall meeting. People listened to her not because she was loud, but because her truth came wrapped in the dignity of 80 years, lived with courage. She stood beside Cameron during the launch of the Sentinel Foundation and told the crowd, "My son died for the truth, and my grandson nearly did too. We are done burying truth in this town." Her words became a slogan painted on murals across Oakwood streets. General Michelle Grant visited Oakwood twice during the year, each time welcomed with applause. She and Cameron shared a bond forged in crisis, a bond of mutual respect anchored in the belief that justice cannot survive without vigilance. During her most recent visit, she walked the Interstate 45 corridor with him, pointing to the highway that had served as the backbone of Brooks's racket. "This road won't carry fear anymore," she said. Cameron nodded, knowing that every mile of concrete held memories of suffering, but also the seeds of change. The federal oversight of Oakwood brought economic renewal. Grants flowed into the schools. New businesses opened along Main Street. A memorial for victims of police violence was installed in the center of town. With Marcus Jackson's name engraved at the top, people left flowers daily. Some left notes of apology for past silence. Others left letters of hope for the next generation. The space became a quiet reminder that grief, when honored, could guide a community toward something better. As Cameron left the cemetery that morning, he saw a small gathering outside the community center. Children held Sentinel devices in their hands, listening to a volunteer explain how each recording could protect them. A boy, no more than 10, approached Cameron shyly. His eyes were wide with admiration. "Sir," he said softly, "do I have to be afraid now?" Cameron looked at him for a long moment, remembering the fear he carried as a child, the nights he lay awake listening for footsteps outside his window, the decades he lived trying to outrun a truth the town refused to confront. He placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and answered with a voice filled with hope. "You don't have to be afraid. You just get to live." The boy nodded, gripping the small device as if it were a shield. Cameron stepped back, watching him run to join the others. The moment felt like a closing chapter, one written not with triumph, but with quiet redemption. He turned toward the sunlight, letting it warm his face, letting it ease the weight of memory. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps these stories be heard.